there is an upcoming Mombasa Health Research Conference. We know that there is a title that requires it to be less than 50 words. We have the authors, that is stating what is the full name, the first and the last name, the institutional affiliation for all the abstract and the co-authors, what is the background, that you're providing an overview of the rationale and foundation of your study, and then the method, response, intervention that clearly outlines your sample, your data type, and the analysis. Now, there are different types of abstracts. We have descriptive abstract and informative abstract. So descriptive abstract actually describes the work that is being abstracted. And this is an outline of the work, and it is very short. It is, as it says, it's a snapshot. So descriptive abstract is usually 100 words or less, and it actually shows what exactly is being conducted. Then we have the informative abstracts. The informative abstracts actually they act as substitutes for the actual papers, and the key arguments and conclusions are usually presented. Specifically, the context and importance of the research, what is the reasons for the methods that was used, and the principal results and conclusions. Now we go into the examples of abstracts. So I'll ask Phyllis to please invite my co-speaker.
Okay, thank you, Daktari. I now welcome our second presenter, Denton Calendar, who has a PhD and is a senior research fellow with Carberry Institute at the University of New South Wales and head of project research for MSF Mombasa project. He leads a diverse portfolio of interdisciplinary and mixed methods research in Australia, Asia, North America, Europe, and Africa. Karibu, Denton.
Asante, Madam, and good evening, everyone. So nice to be here. I love getting a chance to chat about research. I think we can go to the next slide. I don't know if I can do that. No. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so there's such a great introduction from Dr. Adam, on the structure of abstracts. But if you're like me, I really learn best if I'm actually engaging with the content. And so I'm just going to talk through two examples of kind of different styles of abstracts, and also let you know some of the things I like about them, some of the things I don't like, some of the things that are, I think, pretty good, and some of the things that could be improved. So this example actually comes from a study out of Nairobi that was published a couple of years ago. And, thinking about Dr. Adams' comments around the title, I think this one gives a pretty clear view of what the study is about, right? Product access challenges to menstrual health throughout the COVID-19 pandemic among a cohort of adolescent girls and young women in Nairobi, Kenya. This title has a lot of information built into really 2 lines of text, right? So it's an example of a good title because it tells us what the study is about, it tells us where it took place, and it tells us the target population. It even tells us when, because it's talking about the COVID pandemic. So already we have a lot of information. Now, as we've heard, abstracts are typically broken up into 4 sections. So the first section gives us the reason for the study. The second section tells us what happened or what was done. The third section highlights the results, and the fourth section goes into the conclusions. Now, the first thing I want you to really notice here are the relative size of these sections, right? Space is always at a premium in an abstract. it's actually much easier to write many paragraphs about something than it is to try to get all of this information crammed into between 200 and 300 words. So you always need to use your space as wisely as you can. And typically the stuff that's most interesting, typically about a study, is the new information, the stuff we didn't know before, which is to say the findings. So you can see actually, this is where the authors of this abstract have invested most of their space, is in the third section. It takes up, you know, maybe a third, almost half of the whole abstract, whereas each other section only gets a couple sentences each. This is generally what I recommend for people when they're writing abstracts. Really focus on the results, because this is the part that's the most exciting. All right, so maybe we'll just briefly go through this one and look at each section, and again, talk about some of the things that I think are good and maybe things that could be improved. So starting with the background, I think this is a pretty good background section, right? The whole purpose of your background is to give a rationale for this study. Typically, you have limited space, so you want to do two things. You want to establish the reason and talk about the purpose of this study. So they've done that right away. They've established the reason is that access to menstrual hygiene products is important for the health of adolescents and young women. I think we could all agree that's true, but they make that case really clear just in one sentence. And then they go on to say, and because this is important, we've done a study that looks at access during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they also name the design of the study, which in this case is mixed methods. They mentioned that it's longitudinal, it's got 2 time points, and they describe the purpose as looking at trajectories over the pandemic and examining factors associated with access. So I think the great thing about this background section is it gives us so much information in such a small space. And already as a reader, I'm like, okay, I know this study is important. They've convinced me of that. And I know a little bit about what they've done. This is great. This is all your background ever really needs to be. Moving on to the methods section. Again, they've used maybe 3 or 4 sentences here, not a lot of space, but they've captured a lot of the key details, where the data came from, when they were collected, the variables that they examined, in this case, the prevalence of menstrual health product access, how the variables were calculated. In this case, it's at each time point. And for those of you who have spent any time working with different kinds of data, you know there's a million different ways to calculate even something that seems very simple. So it's important that you be very clear and upfront, using what limited space you have to make this point. And then they talk a little bit about the analyses that they did. So the first, if you'll recall, this is a mixed method study. So they first talk about one of the quantitative components, which is that they did logistic regression models. For those of you who are less familiar with statistics, logistic regression is just a type of mathematical formula that looks at the relationship between 2 or more variables. So in this case, they're looking at factors associated with access challenges. So access is the outcome or the dependent variable, and the factors are the associated independent variables. And they describe some variations to their analysis here. To me, this is enough information about their quantitative. I know the name of the test that they did, you know, it's obviously not everything. Again, you don't have space, but it's enough that I can interpret the rest of what's to come. And then they say qualitative data contextualize results. This is probably my least favorite thing about this abstract. This doesn't actually describe the analysis. For those of you who've ever done qualitative research, just like with quantitative research, there are names for the analyses that we do. So it's important that we describe exactly what was done, which they haven't done here. Probably when this was reviewed, and this appeared in a pretty good journal, it appeared in The Lancet. Probably when this was reviewed, it wasn't reviewed by someone with qualitative experience, so they wouldn't have noticed that. which is, I guess, just a reminder that even published work, published abstracts are not perfect. They're just, people's best efforts. All right, so we've made it halfway through the abstract already, and now we're finally getting to the results. And as I said, this is the stuff that we really care about. It's the stuff that's the most exciting. So they've highlighted right away the key results here. At the first time period, 52% of their sample of adolescent and young women experienced access challenges around menstrual health products, which is pretty high. And then they also highlight that 6 months later, so 6 months deeper into the pandemic, this decreased actually quite a bit to 30.3%. So this is kind of what we might call the headline. It appears first in the findings because it's perhaps the most important. And then their second, but still also important result is to look at factors associated with product access challenges. So they go on to talk about levels of education, relationship or living with their parents, otherwise meeting basic needs. These are the factors that, when all things were considered, were related to the likelihood that these young women could access menstrual products. Now, I wouldn't get too caught up when you're reading abstracts on the statistics side of things if it doesn't make sense to you. A good abstract will explain with words what is going on. They will include the statistics because this can help with interpretation, but a general reader should be able to understand what's going on in an abstract. So don't get too flustered if the statistics are unfamiliar. If the author has done their job, it should be clear what's going on here. Yeah, so I generally like this description of the results. They've given us some kind of clear headlines here, and I have some sense of the scope of the problem and some associated factors. They go on to provide some more information that relates to the quantitative component of their study. And then you'll notice, again, maybe I'm just being picky here, but the last line of this abstract just kind of gives us a throwaway bit of information. Qualitative data indicate deprioritization of menstrual health within household budgets as a contributor. Essentially, I think what this means is they found that families were not prioritizing menstrual products when they were, deciding how to spend their money. And of course, that relates to access. Okay, that makes sense. But again, it's one line in a supposed mixed method study, and it's slotted at the end here in a way that feels like an afterthought. Personally, I would have used some of the other space that they had to devote a little bit more time to qualifying their nice statistical analysis with some of the qualitative data. But generally, I think this is a pretty well-written findings, or what we might sometimes call results section. And last but not least, we get to the interpretation, sometimes called conclusions, sometimes called recommendations, but basically all that it is about, this last section, is what does it mean? What are we meant to make of these results? So they say, I think this is the headline for this study, menstrual health product access challenges are prevalent among adolescent and young women during the pandemic. This is probably the most important finding here. 30 to 50% struggling to access menstrual products is really high and obviously bad for health and well-being. Barriers were primarily financial. Again, this is sort of self-evident, but it is shown in their data. And this is a really important part. The findings and the interpretation have to link. If someone says something in the interpretation that I don't see in their data, it makes me a little bit suspicious. And they make a final conclusion, which again is sort of, I think, self-evident. Ensuring access to menstrual products is essential to ensuring adolescent and young women health needs. Sure, I mean, that seems kind of obvious. You have very limited space here, so you rarely can explain exactly what you think your findings mean and what should be done about it. And it's not uncommon for people to make these kind of throwaway statements. I mean, we could all have known that before we read this study, but this study just, I guess, wants to affirm that central point. So overall, just off the back of my head, I would give this abstract, let's